The next day, after Mass, Fernanda led her to a gloomy building that Meme recognized immediately from the evocations that her mother used to make of the convent where she was educated to be a queen, and then she understood that she had reached the end of the term. Trip. A very beautiful novice came out of the office carrying her little suitcase with her 3 changes of clothes. As she passed by her Meme, she held out her hand without stopping. "Come on, Renata," she told him. Meme took her hand and let herself go. The last time Fernanda saw her, trying to match her pace with that of the novice, the iron portcullis had just closed behind her. He still thought of Mauricio Babylonia, in his smell of oil and his environment of butterflies, and he would continue to think of him all the days of his life, until the remote autumn morning when he died of old age, with their names changed and without ever having said a word, in a gloomy hospital in Krakow. Fernanda returned to Macondo on a train protected by armed police. She was told that José Arcadio Segundo was inciting the workers of the banana company to strike. "This is the last thing we need," Fernanda told herself. An anarchist in the family. The strike broke out 2 weeks later and did not have the dramatic consequences that had been feared. The workers hoped that they would not be forced to cut and ship bananas on Sundays, and her request seemed so just that even Father Antonio Isabel interceded on her behalf because he found her in accordance with God's law. He had resigned from the position of gang foreman at the banana company and took the side of the workers. Very soon she was pointed out as an agent of an international conspiracy against public order. One night, she miraculously escaped 4 revolver shots fired at her by a stranger as she was leaving a secret meeting. The atmosphere of the following months was so tense that even Ursula perceived it in her corner of darkness, and she had the impression that she was reliving the hazardous times when her son Orleano carried in his pocket the homeopathic globules of subversion. But Orleano Segundo informed him that his whereabouts had been unknown since the night of the attack. "The same as Orleano," Ursula exclaimed. "It's like the world is spinning." Fernanda remained immune to the uncertainty of those days. She had no contact with the outside world, ever since the violent altercation she had with her husband for having determined Meme's fate without her consent. Orleano Segundo was willing to rescue her daughter, but Fernanda made him see papers in which she showed that she had entered the enclosure of her own free will. Indeed, Meme had. Deep down, Orleano Segundo did not believe in the legitimacy of the evidence, just as he never believed that Mauricio Babylonia had gone into the yard to steal chickens, but both files served to ease his conscience, and he was then able to return to the shadows without remorse. By Petra Coates. Fernanda gave the last turn to the nuts of her plan, which she had accomplished. She wrote a long letter to her son José Arcadio, who was about to receive minor orders from her, and in it she informed him that her sister Renata had expired in the peace of the Lord as a result of black vomit. She then put Amaranta Ursula in the care of Santa Sofia de la Piedad, and dedicated herself to organizing her correspondence with the invisible doctors, upset by Meme's mishap. The first thing she did was set a definite date for the postponed telepathic intervention. But the invisible doctors told her that she was not prudent while the state of social unrest persisted in Macondo. They still disagreed on the hot Wednesday when she knocked on the door of the house, an elderly nun carrying a basket hanging from her arm. He was Meme's son. Fernanda's former spiritual director explained to her in a letter that he had been born 2 months earlier, and that they had allowed him to be baptized with the name Orleano. "We'll say we found it floating in the basket," she smiled. The nun had lunch at home while the return train passed by, but Fernanda pointed her out as an undesirable witness to her shame, and she regretted that the medieval custom of hanging the messenger of bad news had been discarded. It was then that she decided to drown the creature in the pool as soon as the nun left, but her heart did not give her much and she preferred to wait patiently for the infinite goodness of God to free her from her hindrance. The new Orleano had been a year old when the public tension exploded without any announcement. José Arcadio Segundo and other union leaders promoted demonstrations in the towns of the Banana Zone. But on Monday night the leaders were taken from their homes and sent with 5-kilo shackles on their feet to the jail in the provincial capital. Among them they took José Arcadio Segundo and Lorenzo Gavilan, a colonel from the Mexican Revolution, exiled in Macondo. However, within 3 months they were free, because the government and the banana company could not agree on who should feed them in prison. The dissatisfaction of the workers was based this time on the unhealthiness of the houses, the deception of the medical services and the iniquity of the working conditions. They also stated that they were not paid with cash, but with vouchers that were only used to buy Virginia ham in the company's commissaries. José Arcadio Segundo was imprisoned because he revealed that the voucher system was a company resource to finance its fruit boats. The company doctors did not examine the sick. The engineers, instead of building latrines, brought to the camps, at Christmas, a portable toilet for every 50 people. When the workers drew up a unanimous list of demands, a long time passed before they were able to officially notify the banana company. As soon as he learned of the agreement, Mr. Brown hitched his sumptuous glass car to the train and disappeared from Macondo along with the best-known representatives of his company. Shortly after, faced with a new attempt by the workers, the lawyers displayed in public places Mr. Brown's death certificate, which attested that on June 9 he had been run over in Chicago by a fire engine. Tired of that hermeneutical delirium, the workers repudiated the Macondo authorities and took their complaints to the Supreme Courts. It was there that the legal illusionists demonstrated that the claims were invalid, simply because the banana company did not have, had never had, and would never have workers in its service, but recruited them occasionally and on a temporary basis. The big strike broke out. The crops were left halfway, the fruit was passed on the vines, and the trains of 120 wagons stopped on the branch lines. Idle workers overflowed the towns. The Street of the Turks reverberated on a Saturday of many days, and in the billiards hall of the Hotel de Jacob 24-hour shifts had to be established. José Arcadio Segundo was there the day it was announced that the army had been charged with restoring public order. Although he was not a man of omens, the news was for him like an announcement of death, which he had expected since the distant morning when Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez allowed him to see a shooting. He looked out into the street, and saw them. There were 3 regiments whose march, punctuated by the drum of galley slaves, made the earth tremble. Ursula heard them pass from her bed of darkness and raised her hand with crossed fingers. Santa Sofia de la Piedad existed for an instant, leaning over the embroidered tablecloth that she had just ironed, and she thought of her son, José Arcadio Segundo, who watched the last soldiers pass by the door of the Hotel de Jacob without flinching. Martial law empowered the army to arbitrate the dispute, but no attempt at conciliation was made. As soon as they were displayed in Macondo, the soldiers put aside their rifles, cut and shipped the bananas, and mobilized the trains. The workers, who until then had been content to wait, threw themselves into the mountains with no weapons other than their work machetes, and began to sabotage the sabotage. They set fire to farms and police stations, destroyed the rails to prevent the transit of trains that were beginning to open their way with machine gun fire, and cut telegraph and telephone wires. The ditches were stained with blood. Mr. Brown, who was alive in the electrified chicken coop, was taken from Macondo with his family and those of his other compatriots, and taken to safe territory under the protection of the army. The situation threatened to evolve into an unequal and bloody civil war, when the authorities called on the workers to concentrate in Macondo. The call announced that the civil and military chief of the province would arrive the following Friday, ready to intercede in the conflict. José Arcadio Segundo was among the crowd that gathered at the station since Friday morning. Around 12 o'clock, waiting for a train that did not arrive, more than 3,000 people, including workers, women, and children, had overflowed the open space in front of the station and were crowded into the adjacent streets that the army closed with lines of machine guns. A little before 3 the rumor spread that the official train would not arrive until the following day. Beside José Arcadio Segundo was a barefoot, very fat woman with 2 children, ages 4 and 7. She carried her youngest and asked José Arcadio Segundo, without knowing him, to pick up the other one so that he could better hear what they were going to say. José Arcadio Segundo finished off the child on the back of the neck. Many years later, that boy would continue to tell, without anyone believing him, that he had seen the lieutenant reading Decree No. 4 of the civil and military chief of the province with a gramophone horn. It was signed by General Carlos Cortés Vargas, and by his secretary, Major Enrique García Izeza, and in 380-word articles declared the strikers a gang of criminals and empowered the army to shoot them dead. "Ladies and gentlemen," said the captain in a low, slow, slightly tired voice, "you have 5 minutes to withdraw." The hissing and redoubled cries drowned out the clarion call that announced the beginning of the term. Nobody moved. 5 minutes have passed, the captain said in the same tone. 1 more minute and it will catch fire. José Arcadio Segundo, sweating ice, took the child off his shoulders and handed him over to the woman. "These bastards can shoot," she muttered. José Arcadio Segundo towered over the heads in front of him, and for the first time in his life he raised his voice. "Bastards!" The scream dash. "We give them the missing minute." At the end of his shout the captain gave the order to fire and 14 machine gun nests answered him on the spot. But it all seemed like a farce. It was as if the machine guns had been loaded with pyrotechnic snares, for you could hear their eager clatter, and see their incandescent spit, but there was not the slightest reaction, not a voice, not even a sigh, among the compact crowd around them. She seemed petrified by instant invulnerability. Suddenly, on one side of the station, a death cry tore through the enchantment, my mother." José Arcadio Segundo barely had time to pick up the child, while the mother with the other was absorbed by the panicked crowd. Many years later, the boy was still to tell that José Arcadio Segundo lifted him above his head and allowed himself to be dragged, almost in the air, as if floating in the terror of the crowd, towards an adjacent street. The child's privileged position allowed him to see that at that moment the unrestrained mass began to reach the corner and the row of machine guns opened fire. Several voices shouted at the same time. "Get on the ground! Get on the ground!" Those in the front lines had already done so, swept away by the bursts of shrapnel. The survivors, instead of throwing themselves to the ground, tried to return to the square, where the machine guns were also firing relentlessly. The boy saw a woman kneeling, with her arms crossed, in a clean space, mysteriously forbidden to the stampede. José Arcadio Segundo put him there, at the moment of collapsing with his face bathed in blood. When José Arcadio Segundo woke up, he was face up in the dark. She realized that she was riding an endless silent train, and that her hair was caked with dried blood and all her bones ached. He felt an unbearable dream. Willing to sleep for many hours, safe from terror and horror, he settled on the side that hurt him the least, and only then did he discover that he was lying on top of the dead. There was not a free space in the car, except for the central aisle. Trying to escape from the nightmare, José Arcadio Segundo dragged himself from one car to another, in the direction in which the train was moving. He saw the dead men, the dead women, the dead children, who were going to be thrown into the sea like rejected bananas. He only recognized a woman who was selling soft drinks in the plaza and Colonel Gavilan, who still had the belt with the Morlean silver buckle with which he had tried to fight his way through the panic coiled in his hand. When he reached the first car, he jumped into the darkness, and lay in the ditch until the train had passed. It was the longest he had ever seen, with almost 200 freight cars. After midnight a torrential downpour fell. José Arcadio Segundo did not know where he had jumped, but he knew that walking in the opposite direction to that of the train he would reach Macondo. After more than 3 hours of walking, soaked to the skin, with a terrible headache, he saw the first houses in the light of dawn. Drawn by the smell of coffee, he entered a kitchen where a woman with a child in her arms was leaning over the stove. "Good," he said, exhausted. "I am José Arcadio Segundo Buendia." He knew him. He brought a blanket for her to wrap around while she dried her clothes on the stove, heated water for her to wash the wound, which was just a tear in the skin, and gave her a clean diaper to bandage her head. "It must have been about 3,000, he murmured. "What? The dead," he clarified. "It must have been everyone at the station." The woman measured him with a look of pity. "There have been no deaths here," she said. "Since the days of your uncle, the colonel, nothing has happened in Macondo." In 3 kitchens where José Arcadio Segundo stopped before reaching the house, they told him the same thing: there were no deaths. She knocked on the door of Colonel Gavilan's house. A pregnant woman, whom he had seen many times, slammed the door in his face. "She's gone," she said, scared. He came back to his land. José Arcadio Segundo jumped over the patio fence and entered the house through the kitchen. Santa Sofia de la Piedad barely raised her voice. "Don't let Fernanda see you," she said. A while ago she was getting up. As if she were fulfilling an implicit pact, she took her son to the potty room, she fixed Melquiad's dilapidated cot for him, and at 2 in the afternoon, while Fernando was taking a siesta, she passed him a plate of food through the window. Secretly informed by Santa Sofia de la Piedad, at that time he visited her brother in Melquiad's room. Nor did he believe the version of the massacre or the nightmare of the train loaded with dead that traveled to the sea. The night before they had read an extraordinary national proclamation, to report that the workers had obeyed the order to evacuate the station, and were heading home in peaceful caravans. The band also reported that the union leaders, with a high patriotic spirit, had reduced their demands to 2 points, reform of medical services and construction of latrines in homes. It was later reported that when the military authorities obtained the agreement of the workers, they hastened to communicate it to Mr. Brown, and that he had not only accepted the new conditions, but also offered to pay for 3 days of public revelry to celebrate the end of the conflict. Except that when the military asked him for what date the signing of the agreement could be announced, he looked through the window at the sky streaked with lightning, and made a profound gesture of uncertainty. "It will be when it clears up," he said. "While the rain lasts, we suspend all kinds of activities." It hadn't rained for 3 months and it was a dry season. But when Mr. Brown announced his decision, the torrential downpour that surprised José Arcadio Segundo on the road to Macondo rushed through the entire banana zone. The official version ended up prevailing: there were no deaths, the satisfied workers had returned to their families, and the banana company suspended activities while the rain passed. Martial law continued. At night, after curfew, they kicked down doors with rifle butts, dragging suspects from their beds and taking them on a one-way trip. It was still the search for and extermination of criminals, murderers, arsonists, and rioters of Decree No. 4, but the military denied it to the relatives of their victims. In Macondo nothing has happened, nor is it happening, nor will it ever happen. This is a happy town. Thus they consummated the extermination of the union leaders. The only survivor was José Arcadio Segundo. One night in February, the unmistakable pounding of gun butts was heard at the door. Orleano Segundo, who was still waiting for it to clear up before leaving, opened the door for 6 soldiers under the command of an officer. Without saying a word, they searched the house room by room, cupboard by cupboard, from living rooms to barn. Santa Sofia de la Piedad managed to warn José Arcadio Segundo, who was sleeping in Melquiad's room, but he understood that it was too late to try to escape. In front of Melquiades's room, which was once again locked, Santa Sofia de la Piedad turned to one last hope. "No one has lived in that room for about a century," she said. The officer made it open, ran the beam of the flashlight over it, and Orleano Segundo and Santa Sofia de la Piedad saw the Arab eyes of José Arcadio Segundo at the moment in which he passed the flash of light across his face. But the officer continued to scan the room with the flashlight, and gave no sign of interest. The officer stopped looking at the space where Orleano Segundo and Santa Sofia de la Piedad were still looking at José Arcadio Segundo, and the latter also realized that the soldier was looking at him without seeing him. Then he turned off the light and adjusted the door. "It's true that no one has been in that room for at least a century," the officer told the soldiers. "There must be even snakes there." As the door closed, José Arcadio Segundo was certain that his war had ended. In Melquiad's room, on the other hand, protected by the supernatural light, by the sound of the rain, by the sensation of being invisible, he found the repose that he had not had for a single moment in his previous life, and the only fear that persisted was that they buried him alive. Safe from all fear, José Arcadio Segundo devoted himself then to reviewing Melquiad's parchments many times, and all the more at ease the less he understood them. Accustomed to the noise of the rain, which 2 months later became a new form of silence, the only thing that disturbed his solitude was the entrances and exits of Santa Sofia de la Piedad. So he begged her to leave his food on the windowsill and lock the door. The rest of the family forgot, including Fernanda. After 6 months of confinement, given that the soldiers had left Macondo, Orleano Segundo removed the lock looking for someone to talk to while the rain passed. José Arcadio Segundo, devoured by his fur, indifferent to the air rarefied by the nauseating vapors, continued reading and rereading the unintelligible parchments. He hardly looked up when he heard the door open, but his brother's gaze was enough to see the irreparable fate of his great-grandfather repeated in it. "There were more than 3,000, was all that José Arcadio Segundo said. "Now I'm sure it was everyone who was at the station. He reigned 4 years, 11 months, and 2 days. There were times of drizzle all over the world. The sky was unpaved in storms of destruction, and the north sent hurricanes that chipped roofs and knocked down walls, and uprooted the last vines of the plantations. As it happened during the plague of insomnia. Orleano Segundo was one of those who did the most to avoid being overcome by idleness. In order not to get bored, he devoted himself to the task of repairing the numerous damages in the house. His belly gradually deflated like a skin, and the face of a beatific tortoise became less bloody and his jowls less protruding. One morning Ursula woke up feeling that she was ending in a placid stupor, and she had already asked that they take her father Antonio Isabel. Santa Sofia de la Piedad discovered that her back was paved with leeches. They detached them one by one, burning them with firebrands, before they finished bleeding her. It was necessary to dig canals to drain the house, and rid it of toads and snails, so that the floors could dry out, the bricks removed from the legs of the beds, and walk again with shoes. Orleano Segundo did not realize that he was getting old. He amused himself thinking about the things that he could have done in another time with that rain that was already a year away. It might have been thought that the deluge had given him the opportunity to sit down and reflect, but in reality it came to him from much further away, unearthed by the fork of the rain, from the times when he read in Melquiades's room the prodigious fables of the flying tapestries and whales feeding on crude ships. It was around those days that, due to Fernanda's carelessness, little Orleano appeared in the corridor, and his grandfather learned the secret of his identity. He cut his hair, dressed him, taught him to lose his fear of people, and very soon it was seen that he was a legitimate Orleano Buendia, with his high cheekbones, his look of astonishment and his solitary air. For Fernanda it was a break. For Amaranta Ursula, who had already shed her teeth, her nephew was like a slippery toy that comforted her from the boredom of the rain. Orleano Segundo then remembered the English encyclopedia that no one had ever touched in Mime's old bedroom. He began by showing the pictures to the children. Since he did not know English, he began to invent names and legends to satisfy the children's insatiable curiosity. Fernanda truly believed that her husband was waiting for it to clear up to return to his concubine. In the first months of the reign, she feared that he would try to sneak into her bedroom, and that she would go through the shame of revealing to him that she had been unable to reconcile since the birth of Amaranta Ursula. That was the cause of her anxious correspondence with the invisible doctors. Ursula reasonably concluded that her disorders were not uterine but intestinal, and advised her to eat a popsicle of calomel on an empty stomach. No one had come out onto the street again. If it had depended on Fernanda they would never have done it again. However, she was the first to appear when they announced that the funeral of Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez was passing by. They had put the coffin on an ox cart on which they built a shed of banana leaves, but the pressure of the rain was so intense and the streets were so bogged down that at every step the wheels got stuck and the shed was about to collapse. Fall apart. Behind the cart, some barefoot and all with their pants halfway down, the last survivors of the capitulation of Neerlandia splashed in the mud. Ursula had been led to the door by Santa Sofia de la Piedad. Goodbye, Gerinaldo, my son he shouted. Say hello to my people and tell them we'll see each other when it clears up. Orleano Segundo helped her back to bed, and with the same informality with which he treated her, he always asked her the meaning of her farewell. It's true, she said. I'm just waiting for the rain to pass so I can die. The state of the streets alarmed Orleano Segundo. Belatedly worried about the fate of his animals, he threw a waxed canvas over himself and went to Petra Coates's house. He found her in her yard, waist deep in water, trying to dislodge a horse carcass. Ever since the rain began, Petra Coates had done nothing but clear her yard of dead animals. She watched with deaf impotence how the deluge mercilessly exterminated a fortune that was once considered the largest and most solid in Macondo, and of which only the pestilence remained. She was old, in her very bones, and her lanceolate eyes of a carnivorous animal had become sad and meek from looking at the rain so much. Orleano Segundo stayed more than 3 months in his house, not because then he felt better there than in his family's, but because he needed all that time to make the decision to throw the piece of waxed canvas. During the first week he grew accustomed to the wear and tear that time and rain had done to his concubine's health, and little by little he began to see her as she was before, remembering her jubilant excesses and the delirious fecundity she had experienced. His love provoked in the animals. One night in the second week he woke her with urgent caresses. Petra Coates didn't react. Sleep easy, she murmured. The times are no longer for these things. Not because of the times, but because of themselves, who were no longer up to those things. Orleano Segundo returned to the house with his trunk, convinced that not only Ursula, but all the inhabitants of Macondo, were waiting for it to clear up so they could die. They met again in Mime's bedroom, where Orleano Segundo's imagination turned the airship into a flying elephant looking for a place to sleep among the clouds. That is how time passed, until his wife announced that there were no more than 6 kilos of salted meat and a sack of rice left in the barn. Now what do you want me to do? He asked. I don't know, answered Fernanda. That is men's business. Well, said Orleano Segundo, something will be done when it clears up. Orleano Segundo was not aware of the chant until the next day, after breakfast, when he felt dazed by a bee beating that was then more fluid and louder than the sound of the rain, and it was Fernanda who was walking around the house aching. That she had been raised like a queen to end up as a maid in a madhouse, with a lazy husband, who came to bed with his eyes full of glass dust and yet no one had ever said good morning to her. Fernanda, how was your night, Fernanda? They hadn't even asked her, even out of courtesy, why she was so pale or why she woke up with those violet circles under her eyes. That night, during dinner, the exasperating hum of the chant had defeated the sound of the rain. Orleano Segundo ate very little, with his head bowed, and went to the bedroom early. At breakfast the next day, Fernanda was tremulous, looking like she had slept badly, and she seemed completely relieved of her rancor. However, when her husband asked if it would not be possible to eat a warm egg, she did not simply answer that since the previous morning they had run out of eggs. Orleano Segundo took the children to see the encyclopedia, as usual, and Fernanda pretended to tidy up Mime's bedroom, only for him to hear her murmur that, of course, one needed to have a tough face. Orleano Segundo sat down in the corridor, and Fernanda chased him there, saying that, of course, while there were only stones left to eat, her husband would sit down like a sultan of Persia to contemplate the rain, because it was nothing more than that, a behemoth, a maintained, a good-for-nothing. Shut up, please, she begged. Fernanda, on the other hand, raised her tone. I don't have to shut up, she said. Whoever doesn't want to hear me, leave. Then Orleano Segundo lost control. He got up without haste, grabbing one after another the pots of begonias, the pots of ferns, the pots of oregano, and one after another he smashed them on the floor. Orleano Segundo broke the glass of the window, and one by one, without hurrying, he took out the pieces of crockery and smashed them on the floor. Then he washed his hands, threw the waxed cloth over himself, and before midnight he returned with some stiff flaps of salted meat, several sacks of weevilled rice and corn, and a few emaciated bunches of bananas. Since then there was no shortage of things to eat. Amar and Cat Ursula and little Orleano were to remember the deluge as a happy time. Despite Fernanda's strictness, they splashed around in the swamps of the patio, hunting lizards to dismember them. Ursula was her most entertaining toy. They thought she was a large decrepit doll that they carried and brought around corners, disguised with colored rags and her face painted with soot and achiote, and once they were about to gouge out her eyes like they did toads with pruning shears. Nothing caused them so much joy as his ravings. Indeed, something must have happened in her brain in the third year of the reign, because little by little she lost her sense of reality, and she confused the current time with remote times of her life. He sank into such a crazy state of confusion that he believed that little Orleano was his son the colonel at the time they took him to discover ice, and that the Jose Arcadio who was then in the seminary was the eldest son who left with the gypsies. He talked so much about the family that the children learned to organize imaginary visits with beings that had not only existed in different times. Ursula talked with her ancestors about events prior to her own existence. She enjoyed the news they gave her and wept with them for deaths much more recent than the same fellow members. Ursula always posed a question aimed at establishing who it was that had brought a life-size plaster Saint Joseph to the house during the war so that they could keep it while the rain passed. That was how Orleano II remembered the fortune buried somewhere that only Ursula knew about, but the questions and cunning maneuvers that occurred to him were useless. Convinced that Ursula would take the secret to her grave, Orleano II hired a team of excavators under the pretext of building drainage channels in the patio and in the backyard, without finding anything resembling gold in 3 months of exhaustive explorations. He later turned to Pilar Turner in the hope that the decks would see more than the diggers, but she began by explaining that any attempt was useless until it was Ursula who cut her card. Instead, he confirmed the existence of the treasure, specifying that there were 7,214 coins buried in 3 canvas sacks with copper wire bands, inside a circle with a radius of 122 meters, taking the bed as the center. Ursula. The first thing that amazed him, although at the same time increased his confusion, was verifying that it was exactly 122 meters from Ursula's bed to the backyard fence. Prey to an exploratory delirium barely comparable to that of his great-grandfather when he was looking for the root of inventions, Orleano II lost the last pockets of fat that remained to him, and his former resemblance to his twin brother was accentuated again. He did not take care of the children again. He ate at any time, muddy from head to toe. It blasted the foundations of the eastern gallery of the house so deeply that one night they woke up terrified by what seemed to be a cataclysm, both by the tremors and by the terrifying subterranean creaking, and it was that 3 rooms were collapsing and a hole had opened. Crack of chill from the corridor to Fernanda's bedroom. Orleano II did not give up exploration for that. He reinforced the chip foundation, patched the crack with mortar, and continued digging on the west side. It was still there the second week of the following June, when the rain began to calm down and the clouds began to rise, and it was seen that at any moment it was going to clear. So it was, and it didn't rain again for 10 years. Macondo was in ruins. In the swamps of the streets there were pieces of furniture, skeletons of animals. The houses so urgently shut down during the banana rush had been abandoned. The banana company dismantled its facilities. Only rubble remained of the old fenced-in city. The wooden houses, the cool terraces where the serene afternoons of cards passed, seemed swept away by an anticipation of the prophetic wind that years later would erase Macondo from the face of the earth. Orleano II suffered a crisis of affliction the first Sunday that he dressed in dry clothes and went out to explore the town. But in the bottom of their hearts they seemed satisfied to have recovered the town in which they were born. The street of the Turks was the same as before, the Arabs of the third generation were sitting in the same place and in the same attitude as their parents and grandparents, taciturn, undaunted, invulnerable to time and disaster, as alive or as dead as they were after the plague of insomnia and the 32 wars of Colonel Orleano Buendia. Orleano II asked them with his usual informality what mysterious resources they had used to avoid being shipwrecked in the storm, and they all gave him, without agreeing, the same answer: swimming. Petra Coates had managed to keep the house standing. In the last year, she had sent urgent messages to Orleano II, and he had replied that she did not know when she would return to her house. She was then searching for the strength that would allow her to survive misfortune, and she had found a reflective and righteous rage, with which she had sworn to restore the fortune squandered by her lover and just exterminated by the deluge. Orleano II returned to her house 8 months after the last errand, and he found her green, disheveled, with sunken eyelids and frostbitten skin from scabies, but he was writing numbers on little pieces of paper to make a raffle. "You're crazy," he said. "Unless you're thinking of raffling off the bones." Then she told him to go into the bedroom, and Orleano II saw the mule. She was skin to bone, like her owner, but just as alive and determined as she was. Petra Coates had fed her rage, and when she had no more grass, no corn, no roots, he housed her in her own bedroom and fed her percale sheets, Persian tapestries, and tassels. Episcopal bed silk. Ursula had to make a great effort to keep her promise to die when it cleared up. The bursts of lucidity, which were so rare during the rain, became more frequent from August. Ursula wept with pity when she discovered that for more than 3 years she had been a toy for the children. She washed her painted face, brushed off the colored strips. And for the first time since Amaranta's death she left her bed without anyone's help to rejoin family life. The spirit of her invincible heart guided her in the darkness. Those who noticed her stumbling and tripping over her with her archangelic arm always raised at the height of her head thought that she could barely handle her body, but they still did not believe that she was blind. She did not need to see to realize that the flower beds, cultivated with such care since the first reconstruction, had been destroyed by the rain and washed away by Orleano II's excavations, and that the walls and the cement on the floors were cracked. Loose and faded furniture, unhinged doors, and the family threatened by a spirit of resignation and sorrow that would not have been conceivable in his time. and the huge red ants that had thrived in the deluge and were undermining the foundation of the house. "It is not possible to live in this negligence," she said. "At this rate we will end up devoured by the beasts." Since then she had not had a moment of rest. She sunbathed what few clothes were still fit for use, she chased away cockroaches with surprise assaults of insecticide, scraped termite veins on doors and windows, and smothered ants in her burrows with quicklime. The restoration fever ended up taking her to the forgotten rooms. She had the room where José Arcadio Buendía dried up his head looking for the philosopher's stone, cleared of debris and cobwebs. She put in order the silver workshop that had been turned upside down by the soldiers. And lastly she asked for the keys to Melchiad's room to see what state she was in. "Blessed be God! She exclaimed, as if she had seen it all. "So much trying to instill good habits in you, so that you end up living like a pig." José Arcadio Segundo continued rereading the scrolls. The only things visible in the intricate tangle of hairs were the green llama-streaked teeth and the unmoving eyes. "What did he want?" he murmured. "Time passes." "That's right," said Ursula, "but not that much." Saying it, she was aware that she was giving the same reply that she received from Colonel Orleano Buendía in his sentenced cell, and once again she shuddered with the verification that time did not pass, as she had just admitted, but that it was spinning in round. But then, too, she did not give resignation a chance. The simple idea of leaving the room that had given him peace terrified José Arcadio Segundo. He shouted that there was no human power capable of making him leave, because he did not want to see the train of 200 wagons loaded with the dead that left Macondo for the sea every evening. She left him in the room, but she managed to get them not to lock it again, to do the cleaning every day, to throw the bedpans in the trash and leave only one, and to keep José Arcadio Segundo as clean and presentable as he was. Great-grandfather in his long captivity under the chestnut tree. José Arcadio announced to Fernanda around that time from Rome that he planned to go to Macondo before making his perpetual vows. It was that same incentive that induced her to hasten her correspondence with the invisible doctors, and to replenish the pots of ferns and oregano in the corridor. Ursula was already too old and living to spare to repeat the miracle of the candy animals, and none of her descendants had inherited her strength. The house remained closed by order of Fernanda. Orleano Segundo, who had taken his trunks back to Petricote's house, barely had the means to keep the family from starving. With the mule raffle, he and Petricotes had bought other animals, with which they managed to straighten out a rudimentary lottery business. Orleano Segundo went from house to house, he didn't realize that many bought them out of gratitude, and the majority out of compassion. However, it did not take long for it to become a weekly fair, since from dusk onwards fritanaz tables and drink stalls were set up in the patio. And many of the favored ones sacrificed the animal they had won on the spot on the condition that others put on the music and the liquor, so that Orleano Segundo suddenly found himself playing the accordion again, without wanting to, and participating in modest tournaments of voracity. Orleano Segundo discovered how much his spirits had fallen and to what extent his wit as a masterful cumbiambero had dried up. He was a changed man. The 120 kilos that he once had at the time he challenged the elephant had been reduced to 78. For Petricotes, however, he was never a better man than he was then, perhaps because she mistook the compassion that he inspired in her for love, and the feeling of solidarity that misery had awakened in both of them. The dismantled bed ceased to be a place of outrages and became a refuge for confidences. Those masses of poverty were so pure that they always destined the best part for Fernanda, and they never did it out of remorse or charity, but because her welfare mattered more to them than their own. What was really happening to them, although neither of them realized it, was that they both thought of Fernanda as the daughter they would have liked to have and did not have. However, no matter how hard they worked, they weren't even enough to live on. Orleano Segundo thought without saying it that evil was not in the world, but in some hidden place in the mysterious heart of Petricotes, where something had happened during the flood that made the animals sterile and the money elusive. Intrigued by this enigma, he delved so deeply into her feelings that, looking for her interest, he found her love, because trying to make her love him, he ended up loving her. Petricotes, for her part, loved him more as he felt her affection increase, and it was thus that in the fullness of autumn he again believed in the youthful superstition that poverty was a servitude of love. Both then evoked as a hindrance the wild parties, ostentatious wealth, and unbridled fornication, and lamented how much life it had cost them to find the paradise of shared solitude. Madly in love after so many years of sterile complicity, they enjoyed the miracle of loving each other both at the table and in bed, and became so happy that even when they were two exhausted old men they continued to frolic like bunnies and fight like dogs. The raffles never gave for more. Orleano Segundo was so busy trying to consolidate the prestige of his raffles that he barely had time to see the children. Fernanda put Amaranta Ursula in a private school where no more than 6 students were admitted, but she refused to allow Orleano to attend the public school. So he remained locked up, at the mercy of the charitable surveillance of Santa Sofia de la Piedad and the mental alternatives of Ursula. He was fine, stuffy, with a curiosity that drove adults crazy, but unlike the inquisitive and sometimes clairvoyant look the colonel had at his age, his was flickering and a little distracted. But once when Fernanda caught him putting scorpions in a box to put on Ursula's mat, he confined him to Mime's old bedroom, where he distracted himself from his solitary hours reviewing the pages of the encyclopedia. There she found him. Ursula, she asked him who he was. I'm Orleano Buendia, he said. It's true, she replied. It's about time you started learning silversmithing. She again confused him with her son, because the warm wind that followed the deluge and infused Ursula's brain with occasional bursts of lucidity had just passed. He never came to his senses again. He came to mix the past with the present in such a way that in the 2 or 3 bursts of lucidity that he had before he died, no one knew for sure if he was talking about what he felt or what he remembered. Little by little he was reduced, fetishizing himself, mummifying himself in life, to the point that in his last months he was a lost prune inside his nightgown, and his always raised arm ended up looking like the leg of a tomboy. He remained motionless for several days. She looked like a newborn old lady. They laid her down on the altar to see that she was barely bigger than the Christ child, and one afternoon they hid her in a cupboard in the barn where rats could have eaten her. One Palm Sunday they entered the bedroom while Fernanda was at Mass, and they grabbed Ursula by the neck and ankles. Poor great-great-grandmother, Amaranta, Ursula said, she died of old age on us. Ursula was startled. I'm alive, she said. You see, Amaranta, Ursula said, repressing her laughter, he's not even breathing. I'm talking. Ursula yelled. He doesn't even speak, Orleano said. She died like a cricket. Then Ursula surrendered to the evidence. My God, she exclaimed softly. So this is death. She began an endless, hurried, deep prayer that lasted for more than 2 days, and that on Tuesday had degenerated into a jumble of supplications to God. Orleano II tried to take advantage of his delirium to get him to confess where the gold was buried, but once again his pleas were useless. Santa Sofia de la Piedad was certain that she would find her dead at any moment, because she observed in those days a certain bewilderment of nature. She woke up dead on Holy Thursday. She had estimated her between 115 and 122 years. They buried her in a little box that was barely bigger than the basket in which Orleano was carried, and very few people attended the funeral, partly because there were not many who remembered her, and partly because that noon it was so hot that the disoriented birds crashed like pellets against the walls and broke the metal mesh of the windows to die in the bedrooms. At first it was believed to be a plague. The housewives were exhausted from sweeping up dead birds. On Easter Sunday, the centenarian Father Antonio Isabel affirmed in the pulpit that the death of the birds was due to the bad influence of the wandering Jew, whom he himself had seen the night before. He described it as a hybrid of male goat crossed with female heretic, an infernal beast whose breath burned the air and whose visit would determine the conception of spawns by the newlyweds. But a woman woke everyone up at dawn on Wednesday, because she found some cloven-hoofed bipedal tracks who teamed up to set up traps in their yards. 2 weeks after Ursula's death, Petra Coates and Orleano II woke up with a start. When they got up, a group of men were already unsnapping the monster from the sharp sticks that had stopped at the bottom of a pit covered with dry leaves, and it had stopped falling. He weighed like an ox, despite the fact that his height was no more than that of a teenager, and green, unctuous blood flowed from his wounds. His body was covered with rough fur, plagued by small ticks, and his skin petrified by a crust of remora. His human parts were more of a valetudinary angel than a man. They hung him by his ankles from an almond tree in the square, so that no one would be left without seeing him, and when he began to rot they incinerated him in a bonfire, because it was not possible to determine whether his bastard nature was that of an animal to be thrown into the river or of Christian to bury. It was never established whether it was actually because of him that the birds died, but the newlyweds did not conceive the announced spawns, nor did the intensity of the heat diminish. Rebecca died at the end of that year. Argenita, her lifelong maid, asked the authorities for help to break down the door of the bedroom where her employer had been locked up for 3 days, and they found her in the lonely bed, curled up like a shrimp, with her head peeled by ringworm, and the thumb stuck in the mouth. Orleano II took charge of the funeral, and tried to restore the house to sell it, but there was no mortar thick enough to prevent the weeds from crushing the floors and the ivy from rotting the posts. On a new anniversary of the Treaty of Neerlandia, emissaries from the President of the Republic arrived in Macondo to finally hand over the award that had been rejected several times by Colonel Orleano Buendia, and they lost an entire afternoon looking for someone to tell them where they could find someone of their descendants. Orleano II was tempted to receive it, believing it to be a solid gold medal, but Petra Coates persuaded him of the indignity when the emissaries were already preparing edicts and speeches for the ceremony. Also around that time the gypsies returned, the last heirs of Melchiad's science, and found the town so finished and its inhabitants so far removed from the rest of the world, that they went back into the houses dragging magnetized irons as if they were really the last discovery of the Babylonian sages, and refocused the sun's rays with the gigantic magnifying glass, and with the gypsy woman who was removing and putting on her false teeth. A dilapidated yellow train that did not bring or take anyone, and that barely stopped at the deserted station, was the only thing that remained of the massive train. The curial delegates who had gone to investigate the report on the strange death of the birds and the sacrifice of the wandering Jew found Father Antonio Isabel playing blind man's hen with the children, and believing that his report was the product of a senile hallucination, they took him to an asylum. Shortly after they sent Father Augusto Angel, who was going from house to house waking up sleepyheads to go to mass, but within a year he too was defeated by the negligence that was in the air. After Ursula's death, the house fell back into an abandonment from which not even a will as determined and vigorous as Amar and Ursulus could rescue it, who many years later opened doors and windows to scare away the ruin, restored the garden, exterminated the ants, and tried in vain to awaken the forgotten spirit of hospitality. Fernanda's cloistered passion put an impassable dam on Ursula's torrential 100 years. She not only refused to open the doors when the arid wind passed, but she had the windows closed with wooden cross pieces. Her wasteful correspondence with the invisible doctors ended in failure. In fact, her pernicious habit of not calling things by her name had given rise to a new confusion, for all the telepathic surgeons found was a descent of the uterus which could be corrected by the use of a pessary. The disillusioned Fernanda tried to obtain more precise information, but the unknown correspondence did not reply to her letters again. Santa Sofia de la Piedad wandered in a lonely old age, cooking what little they ate, and almost entirely dedicated to the care of José Arcadio II. Amaranta Ursula, heiress to certain charms of Remedios, La Bella, occupied in doing her schoolwork the time that she had previously wasted in tormenting Ursula, and she began to manifest a good judgment and a dedication to the studies that brought about a rebirth in Orleano II, the good one. Hope that inspired him meme. She had promised to send her to finish her studies in Brussels, and that illusion had led him to try to revive the lands devastated by the flood. The few times he was seen in the house then, it was because of Amar and Ursula, because over time he had become a stranger to Fernanda, and little Orleano was becoming elusive and self-absorbed as he approached puberty. But Orleano himself seemed to prefer confinement and solitude. When Ursula had Melchiad's room opened, he began to wander around it, peeking through the ajar door, and no one knew at what point he ended up linked to José Arcadio II by reciprocal affection. His point of view, contrary to the general interpretation, was that Macondo was a prosperous place and on the right track until it was messed up and corrupted and squeezed out by the banana company, whose engineers caused the deluge as a pretext to avoid commitments with the workers. In reality, despite the fact that everyone thought he was crazy, José Arcadio II was at that time the most lucid inhabitant of the house. He taught little Orleano to read and write, he started him in the study of parchments. They both discovered at the same time that it was always March there and it was always Monday, and then they understood that José Arcadio Buendia was not as crazy as the family had said, but that he was the only one who had had enough lucidity to glimpse the truth that over time it suffered stumbling blocks and accidents, and could therefore splinter and leave an eternalized fraction in a room. José Arcadio II had also managed to classify the cryptic letters on the scrolls. He was sure that they corresponded to an alphabet of 47 to 53 characters, that separated they looked like little spiders and ticks, and that in Melchiad's exquisite handwriting they looked like pieces of clothing hung out to dry on a wire. Around the time the riddle lottery occurred to him, Orleano II woke up with a lump in his throat, as if he were repressing the urge to cry. Orleano II visited Pilar Ternera, who discussed the matter with the decks. He saw the knight of coins with its throat wounded by the steel of the jack of spades, and deduced that Fernanda was trying to get her husband to return to the house through the discredited system of sticking pins in his portrait, but that it had caused a tumor internal by a clumsy knowledge of their evil arts. He finally found half a dozen pessaries in their original boxes in the back of the closet. He had half a dozen brought and burned in a bonfire that he lit in the patio. To avert Fernanda's supposed spell, he instructed Orleano II to wet a broody hen and bury it alive under the chestnut tree, and he did so in such good faith that when he finished hiding the disturbed earth with dry leaves, he already felt that he breathed better. On her part, Fernanda interpreted her disappearance as a reprisal from the invisible doctors, and she sewed a drawstring pouch inside her camisole, where she kept the new pessaries that her son had sent her. 6 months after the hen was buried, Orleano II woke up at midnight with a fit of coughing and feeling that they were strangling him from the inside with crab claws. It was then that he realized that no matter how many magical pessaries he destroyed and how many conjuring hens he soaked, the one sad truth was that he was dying. He didn't tell anyone. Tormented by the fear of dying without sending Amar and Ursula to Brussels, he worked as he had never done before, and instead of one he held 3 weekly raffles. He made moving efforts to seem happy, friendly, loquacious, but it was enough to see his sweat and paleness to know that he couldn't with his soul. They ended up losing respect for him, making fun of him, and in his last months they no longer called him Don Orleano, as they had always done, but called him to his face Don Divina Providencia. His voice was filling up with false notes, it was getting out of temper and he ended up fading away in a dog snore. So he conceived the idea of making the fabulous raffle of the lands destroyed by the deluge, which could well be restored by whoever had the capital. Societies were formed to buy tickets at 100 pesos each, which sold out in less than a week. The night of the raffle, the winners threw a spectacular party, and Orleano II played the forgotten songs of Francisco el Hombre on the accordion for the last time, but he could no longer sing them. 2 months later, Amar and Cat Ursula went to Brussels. Orleano II gave him not only the money from the extraordinary raffle, but also the money that he had managed to save in the previous months. A boarding house for young Catholics attended by nuns, where Amar and Cat Ursula promised to live until the end of her studies. In addition, the parish priest arranged for her to travel in the care of a group of Franciscans who were going to Toledo, where they hoped to find trustworthy people to send her to Belgium. A few months later, at the time of her death, Orleano II was to remember her as he had seen her the last time, trying to get off the dusty glass of the second-class carriage without success, to listen to Fernanda's last recommendations. She had her petite body, loose, long hair, and lively eyes that Ursula had at her age, and the way she said goodbye to her, without crying but without smiling, revealed the same strength of character as Ursula. Orleano II was barely able to reciprocate with a wave from her, when her daughter sent him a kiss with the tips of her fingers. The spouses remained motionless under the scorching sun, watching how the train faded into the black dot on the horizon, and linked arms for the first time since the wedding day. On August 9, before the first letter from Brussels was received, José Arcadio II was talking with Orleano in Melquiades' room, and out of the blue he said, "Always remember that there were more than 3,000 and that they were kicked out." Then he fell flat on the scrolls, and he died with his eyes open. At that very moment, in Fernanda's bed, her brother, her twin, reached the end of the prolonged and terrible martyrdom of the iron crabs that ate his throat. A week earlier he had returned home, voiceless, breathless and almost bare bones, with his nomadic trunks and perdulario accordion, to fulfill his promise to die with his wife. Petra Coates helped him gather his clothes and waved him off without shedding a tear, but she forgot to give him the patent leather shoes he wanted to wear in the coffin. So when he found out that he had died, he dressed in black, wrapped the booties in a newspaper, and asked Fernanda for permission to see her corpse. Fernanda didn't let her pass the door. "Put yourself in my place," she begged Petra Coates. "Imagine how much I must have loved him to endure this humiliation." "There is no humiliation that a concubine does not deserve," she replied Fernanda. "So wait until another one of the many dies to put those lutes on him." In fulfillment of her promise, Santa Sofia de la Piedad cut the throat of José Arcadio II's body with a kitchen knife to ensure that he would not be buried alive. The bodies were placed in identical coffins, and there they were found to be identical again in death, as they had been until adolescence. Orleano II's old party mates put a crown on his box that had a purple ribbon with the sign, "Move away, cows, life is short." In the last-minute tumult, the sad drunks who carried them out of the house mixed up the coffins and buried them in the wrong graves. Orleano did not leave Melquiades' room for a long time. He memorized the fantastic legends of the Unbound Book, the synthesis of the studies of Herman, the cripple, so that he reached adolescence without knowing anything about his time, but with the basic knowledge of medieval man. Santa Sofia de la Piedad found him absorbed in reading. At dawn she brought him a cup of coffee without sugar, and at noon a plate of rice with fried plantain slices, which was the only thing eaten in the house after Orleano II's death. None of his sons resembled him so much, not even Orleano José, above all because of his pronounced cheekbones and the resolute and somewhat ruthless line of his lips. Santa Sofia de la Piedad believed that Orleano was talking to himself. In reality, she was talking to Melquiades. One fiery noon, shortly after the death of the twins, she saw against the reverberation of the window the gloomy old man with the raven-winged hat, like the materialization of a memory that had been in her memory since long before she was born. Orleano had finished classifying the alphabet on the parchments. So when Melquiades asked him if he had discovered in what language they were written, he did not hesitate to answer. "In Sanskrit," he said. Melquiades revealed to him that his chances of returning to his room were limited. But he went quietly to the meadows of definitive death, because Orleano had time to learn Sanskrit in the years that were missing before the parchments were a century old and could be deciphered. It was he who told him that in the alley that ended in the river, a Catalan scholar had a bookstore where there was a Sanskrit primer that would be eaten by moths 6 years later if he didn't hurry up and buy it. For the first time in her long life, Santa Sofia de la Piedad let a feeling shine through, and she got the money by selling one of the 17 little goldfish that were left in her workshop. Orleano was advancing in his studies of Sanskrit, while Melquiades was becoming less assiduous and more distant, vanishing in the radiant light of noon. The last time Orleano felt him, he was barely an invisible presence that murmured, "I died of fever in the dunes of Singapore." The room then became vulnerable to dust, heat, termites, red ants, moths that would turn the wisdom of books and parchments into sawdust. In the house there was no lack of food, An errand boy brought a basket with things to eat every Wednesday, which was enough for a week. No one ever knew that those provisions were sent by petticoats, with the idea that continued charity was a way of humiliating whoever had humiliated her. However, the rancor dissipated much sooner than she herself expected, and so she continued to send the food out of pride and finally out of compassion. Several times, she stayed without eating so that Fernanda could eat, and she did not stop fulfilling her commitment until she saw her funeral go by. For Santa Sofia de la Piedad, the reduction of the inhabitants of the house should have been the rest to which she was entitled after more than half a century of work. That she planted in the family the angelic seeds of Remedios, La Bella, and the mysterious solemnity of José Arcadio II, that she devoted a whole life of solitude and silence to the upbringing of some children who barely remembered that they were her children and grandchildren, and that she took care of Orleano as if it had come from her womb, without herself knowing that she was her great-grandmother. Only in a house like this was it conceivable that she had always slept on a mat that she spread out on the floor of the barn, amid the nightly din of rats. Because the worries of the bakery, the upheavals of the war, the care of the children, left no time to think about the happiness of others. Petticoats, whom she had never seen, was the only one who remembered her. She was aware that she had a good pair of shoes to get out of her, that she never lacked a dress, even in the days when she worked miracles with the money from the raffles. When Fernanda arrived at the house she had reason to believe that she was an eternal servant, and although she heard several times that she was the mother of her husband, that was so incredible to her that it took her longer to find out than her to forget it. But when Ursula died, the inhuman diligence of Santa Sofia de la Piedad, her tremendous capacity for work, began to break down. It wasn't just that she was old and worn out, but the house plunged overnight into a crisis of senility. A tender moss climbed up the walls. Without time or resources to prevent the outrages of nature, Santa Sofia de la Piedad spent the day in the bedrooms, scaring away the lizards that would come back at night. Fernanda, writing letters to her children, was unaware of the unstoppable onslaught of destruction. Santa Sofia de la Piedad continued to fight alone, fighting the weeds so that it would not enter the kitchen. But when he saw that Melquiades's room was also cobwebbed and dusty, even if he swept and shook it 3 times a day, and that despite his cleaning fury it was threatened by the rubble and the air of misery that only Colonel Orleano Buendia and the young soldier had foreseen, she understood that she was defeated. "I give up," she told Orleano. "This is a lot of house for my poor bones." Orleano asked her where she was going, and she made a vague gesture, as if she had no idea of her destination. She tried to specify, however, that she was going to spend her last years with a first cousin who lived in Riohacha. It was not a plausible explanation. Since the death of her parents, she had not had contact with anyone in the town, nor did she receive letters or messages, nor was she heard of any of her relatives. Orleano gave her 14 little gold fishes, because she was willing to leave with the only thing she had, 1 peso and 25 cents. From her bedroom window, he watched her cross the patio with her little bundle of clothes, dragging her feet and bowed with age, and he saw her put her hand through a gap in the gate to put the latch on. After have gone out, he never heard from her again. When she found out about her escape, Fernanda burned her fingers trying to light a stove for the first time in her life, and she had to ask Orleano to teach her how to prepare coffee. Over time, it was he who did the kitchen chores. Even in those circumstances, Orleano and Fernanda did not share the solitude, but each one continued to live in his own, cleaning the respective room, while the cobweb covered the rose bushes with snow, covering the beams, padding the walls. It was around that time that Fernanda had the impression that the house was filling up with goblins. It was as if objects, especially those of daily use, had developed the ability to change places on their own. She came to believe it was goblin mischief, and opted to secure everything where she needed to use it. Neither Amar and Tat Ursula, in Brussels, nor José Arcadio, in Rome, ever found out about those insignificant misfortunes. Fernanda told them that she was happy, and in fact she was, precisely because she felt liberated from all commitment, as if life had dragged her back to the world of her parents, where she did not suffer from daily problems because they were resolved in advance in the imagination. Her endless correspondence made him lose track of time, especially after she left Santa Sofia de la Piedad. Instead, her spirit was lifted by news that for others would have been insignificant, like the one that her son had seen the Pope. More than 3 years had passed since Santa Sofia de la Piedad brought him the grammar, when Orleano managed to translate the first sheet of it. But the text in Castilian did not mean anything, they were encrypted verses. Orleano lacked the elements to establish the keys that would allow him to unravel them, but since Melquiades had told him that the books he would need to get to the bottom of the parchments were in the store of the wise Catalan, he decided to talk to Fernanda so that she would allow him to go to look for them. He was so excited that permission would not be denied him that one morning he cut off his shoulder-length hair, shaved off his matted beard, put on tight pants and a shirt with a false collar he didn't know about, who had inherited, and waited in the kitchen for Fernanda to go to breakfast. The woman of every day did not arrive, the one with the raised head and the stony walk, but an old woman of unearthly beauty, with a yellowish ermine cape, a crown of golden cardboard, and the languid demeanor of someone who has secretly wept. Actually, since she found it in Orleano Segundo's trunk, Fernanda had put on the moth-eaten queen dress many times. Merely, she had turned her royal outfits into a memory machine. The first time she put them on she couldn't help but a knot formed in her heart and her eyes filled with tears, and her soul crystallized with nostalgia for lost dreams. And only then did she discover how much the bursts of oregano were needed in the corridor, and the steam from the rose bushes at sunset, and even the bestial nature of the upstarts. Her heart of ash caked on her, which had resisted the most accurate blows of everyday reality without fail, crumbled at the first onslaught of nostalgia for her. The need to feel sad about her was becoming a vice as the years devastated her. She humanized herself in solitude. However, the morning she entered the kitchen and found a cup of coffee offered to her by a pale, bony adolescent with a hallucinated gleam in his eyes, she was torn by the claw of ridicule. She not only refused her permission, but from then on she carried the house keys in the bag where she kept the unused pessaries. It was a useless precaution, because if Orleano had wanted to, he could have escaped and even returned home without being seen. But the prolonged captivity, the uncertainty of the world, the habit of obeying, had dried up the seeds of rebellion in her heart. So she went back to her enclosure, going over and over the scrolls. One morning he went as usual to light her stove, and she found in the extinguished ashes the food he had left for her the day before. She then looked into her bedroom, and saw her lying on the bed, covered with the ermine cape, more beautiful than ever, and with her skin turned into a shell of ivory. 4 months later, when José Arcadio arrived, she found it intact. It was impossible to conceive of a man more like her mother. He was livid, languid, with astonished eyes and weak lips. The house was impregnated as he passed with the fragrance of Florida water that Ursula poured on his head when he was a child. José Arcadio was still an autumnal child, terribly sad and lonely. He went directly to his mother's bedroom, where Orleano had vaporized mercury for 4 months in the aether of his grandfather's grandfather, to preserve the body according to Melchiad's formula. José Arcadio did not ask any questions. He kissed the corpse on the forehead, took the drawstring pouch from under her skirt, where there were 3 pessaries still unused, and the key to the wardrobe. He took out of the closet a small damascene chest with the family coat of arms, and found inside, scented with sandalwood, the voluminous letter in which Fernanda unburdened her heart of the innumerable truths that she had hidden from him. "So," she said in a voice that had something of a razor, "you're the bastard. I'm Orleano Buendia." "Go to your room," José Arcadio said. Orleano left, and he didn't come out again, not even out of curiosity when he heard the rumor of solitary funerals. He did not hear his voice for many months, not only because José Arcadio did not speak to him, but because he had no desire for it to happen, nor time to think about anything other than the parchments. When Fernanda died, he had taken out the penultimate little fish and had gone to the wise Catalan's bookstore in search of the books he needed. Orleano had no difficulty in rescuing from that fabled mess the 5 books he was looking for. Without saying a word, he handed them along with the little goldfish to the Catalan scholar, and the latter examined them, and his eyelids contracted like 2 clams. "You must be crazy," he said in his language, shrugging his shoulders, and returned the 5 books and the little fish to Orleano. "Take them away," he said in Spanish. "The last man to read those books must have been Isaac the Blind, so think hard about what you do." José Arcadio restored Mime's bedroom, and put the abandoned bathroom back into service. His trashy empire was reduced to those 2 places. He never ate at home. He went out to the street when the heat of the siesta slackened, and he didn't return until late at night. Then he continued his anguished wandering, breathing like a cat, and thinking about Amaranta. Many times, he had opened his eyes in the middle of his dream, and he had seen Amaranta emerging from a pool of Brocatel marble, with her lace petticoats and her bandage in her hand, idealized by the anxiety of exile. Contrary to Orleano José, who tried to suffocate that image of her in the bloody swamp of war, he tried to keep her alive in a quagmire of concupiscence, while he entertained her mother with the endless nonsense of his pontifical vocation. Neither he nor Fernanda ever thought that their correspondence was an exchange of fantasies. José Arcadio, who left the seminary as soon as he arrived in Rome, continued to feed the legend of theology and canon law. In the exhausting insomnia of asthma, he measured and remeasured the depth of his misfortune, while he reviewed the gloomy house where Ursula's senile fuss instilled in him the fear of the world. To be sure she wouldn't lose him in the dark, she had assigned him a corner of the bedroom, the only one where she could be safe from the dead that wandered through the house since dusk. "Anything bad you do," Ursula told him, "the saints will tell me." The gloomy nights of her childhood were reduced to that corner, where he remained motionless until bedtime. It was a useless torture, because by that time he was already terrified of everything around him, and was prepared to be frightened of everything he found in life, and everything, in short, everything that God had created with his infinite goodness, and that the devil had perverted. When he woke up, crushed by the winch of nightmares, the light from the window and Amaranta's caresses in the pool freed him from terror. Even Ursula was different under the radiant light of the garden, because there she didn't talk to him about scary things, she combed his hair like a pope, and she soaked him with Florida water so that his body and his clothes had the fragrance of a pope. Almost a year after his return to the house, having sold the silver candlesticks and the heraldic chamber pot for food, Jose Arcadio's only distraction was picking up children in town so they could play in the house. The children took over the house as Mime's classmates did in the past. Orleano didn't worry about the invasion until they went to bother him in Melchiad's room. One morning, two children pushed open the door, startled at the sight of the shabby, hairy man still deciphering the parchments on the work table. Another morning, four children entered the room while Orleano was in the kitchen, ready to destroy the parchments. But as soon as they took possession of the yellowed sheets, an angelic force lifted them from the ground, and kept them suspended in the air, until Orleano returned and snatched the parchments from them. Since then they haven't bothered him again. The four older boys, who wore shorts despite the fact that they were already approaching adolescence, took care of Jose Arcadio's personal appearance. One of the boys, who had curly blonde hair and pink glass eyes like rabbits, used to sleep in the house. The bonds that united him to Jose Arcadio were so firm that they accompanied him in his asthmatic insomnia, without speaking, wandering with him through the house in the dark. One night they saw in the bedroom where Ursula slept a yellow glow through the crystallized cement. There were the three canvas sacks closed with copper wire and, inside them, the 7,214 doubloons at 4. The discovery of the treasure was like an explosion. Instead of returning to Rome with the untimely fortune, which was the dream matured in misery, Jose Arcadio turned the house into a decadent paradise. The dining room cupboard was filled with sugared fruit, hams, and pickles, and the disused barn was reopened to store wines and spirits. One night he and the four older children had a party that lasted until dawn. At 6 in the morning they came out of the bedroom naked, emptied the pool and filled it with champagne. When Jose Arcadio returned from the bathroom, he found them sleeping huddled together, naked, in a shipwrecked bedroom. Inflamed not so much by the havoc as by the disgust and pity he felt for himself, he armed himself with some ecclesiastical dog-catcher disciplines that he kept in the bottom of the trunk, along with a hair shirt and other irons of mortification and penance, and expelled the children of the house, howling like a madman, and whipping them without mercy. He was devastated, with an asthma attack that lasted for several days, and that gave him the appearance of a dying man. On the third night of torture, overcome by suffocation, he went to Orleano's room to ask him to buy him some powder to inhale at a nearby pharmacy. That was how Orleano made his second outing on the street. The second vision of the deserted town, barely lit by the yellowish bulbs in the streets, did not arouse more curiosity in Orleano than the first time. His indifference to the world was so true that a few days later Jose Arcadio violated the promise he had made to his mother, and left him free to go out whenever he wanted. "I have nothing to do in the street," Orleano replied. He remained locked up, absorbed in the parchments that he was unraveling little by little, and whose meaning, however, he could not interpret. He was not interested in the scrolls, which he considered more of an esoteric entertainment, but he was struck by the rare wisdom and inexplicable knowledge of the world that this desolate relative had. Orleano, for his part, was surprised that Jose Arcadio, seen up close, was so different from the image he had formed of him when he saw him wandering around the house. He was capable of laughing, of allowing himself from time to time a nostalgia for the past of the house, and of worrying about the atmosphere of misery in which Melchiad's room was found. That rapprochement between two lonely people of the same blood was far from friendship, but it allowed them both to better cope with the unfathomable loneliness that at the same time separated them and united them. One hot morning they both woke up alarmed by a pressing knock on the front door. He was a dark old man, with large green eyes that gave his face a spectral phosphorescence, and a cross of ashes on his forehead. The secret force that allowed him to live was not the instinct of self-preservation, but the habit of fear. He was Orleano Amador, the only survivor of the 17 children of Colonel Orleano Buendia. He identified himself, begged them to give him shelter in that house that he had evoked on his nights as an outcast as the last safe haven he had left in his life. But Jose Arcadio and Orleano did not remember him. Believing him to be a homeless man, they pushed him out into the street. Two police agents who had persecuted Orleano Amador for years emerged from among the almond trees on the opposite sidewalk and fired 2 Mauser shots at him that penetrated cleanly through the cross of ashes. In fact, ever since he expelled the children from the house, Jose Arcadio had been waiting for news of an ocean liner leaving for Naples before Christmas. He had even made plans to let her set up a business that would allow her to live, because the basket of groceries hadn't arrived since Fernanda's funeral. However, even that final dream was not to be fulfilled. Jose Arcadio was finishing his daily bath when the 4 children that he had expelled from the house burst through the openings in the tiles. Without giving him time to defend himself, they got dressed in the pool, grabbed him by the hair and kept his head in the water. Then they took the 3 sacks of gold that only they and their victim knew where they were hidden. Orleano, locked in his room, didn't notice anything. That afternoon, having missed him in the kitchen, he looked for José Arcadio throughout the house, and found him floating in the scented mirrors of the pool, huge and swollen, and still thinking about Amaranta. Only then did he realize how much he had begun to love him. Amaranta Ursula returned with the first angels of December, carrying her husband tied around her neck with a silk cord. She appeared unannounced, wearing an ivory dress, a string of pearls reaching almost to her knees, emerald and topaz rings, and round, straight hair tipped at the ears with swallow tips. The man she had married 6 months earlier was a mature Flemish, slender, with the air of a sailor. He didn't even allow himself a day off after the long journey. She undertook a new restoration of the house. So that 3 months after her arrival, the air of youth and party that existed in the days of the pianola was breathed again. With a broom she finished off the funerary souvenirs and the piles of useless churimbecos, and the only thing she kept, out of gratitude to Ursula, was the daguerreotype of Remedios in the living room. "Look what a luxury," she would shout, dying of laughter. A 14-year-old great-grandmother. When one of the masons told her that the house was inhabited by ghosts, and that the only way to scare them away was to look for the treasures they had left buried, she replied with laughter that she did not believe in the superstitions of men. She was so spontaneous, so emancipated, with such a modern and free spirit, that Orleano didn't know what to do with her body when he saw her arrive. She forced him to change the squalid pants that he inherited from Colonel Orleano Buendia, gave him youthful shirts and 2-color shoes, and pushed him out into the street when he spent a lot of time in Melchiad's room. Active, petite, indomitable, like Ursula, and almost as beautiful and provocative as Remedios the Beauty, she was endowed with a rare instinct for anticipating fashion. It was incomprehensible that a woman with that spirit had returned to a dead town, depressed by dust and heat, and even less so with a husband who had plenty of money to live well anywhere in the world. However, as time passed, her intention to stay was more evident, since she did not conceive plans that were not long-term. A year after her return, although she had not managed to strike up a friendship or promote a party, Amaranta Ursula still believed that it was possible to rescue that community chosen by misfortune. Gaston, her husband, took care of her not to upset her, although from the deadly noon when he got off the train he understood that her wife's determination had been provoked by a mirage of nostalgia. Certain that she would be defeated by reality, she didn't even bother to assemble the velocipede. Though he was at least 15 years older than her wife, her youthful tastes, her vigilant determination to make her happy, and her good lover virtues made up for the difference in hers. They could not have thought that he had an unbridled pact of love with his young wife, and that both yielded to reciprocal pressure in the least suitable places and where inspiration surprised them. They had known each other for 3 years before getting married. She spoke of Macondo as the most luminous and placid town in the world, and of an enormous house, scented with oregano, where she wanted to live until old age with a loyal husband and 2 indomitable sons named Rodrigo and Gonzalo, and in no case Orleano and José Arcadio, and a daughter named Virginia, and in no case Remedios. But when 2 years had passed in Macondo and Amaranta Ursula was still as happy as the first day, he began to give warning signs. By then he had already dissected all the insects that could be dissected in the region, he spoke Spanish like a native. He did not have the excuse of the weather to hasten his return, because nature had endowed him with a colonial liver. He liked Creole food so much that he once ate a string of 82 iguana eggs. Amaranta Ursula, on the other hand, had fish and seafood brought to her on the train in ice boxes, canned meats and fruit in syrup, which was the only thing she could eat, and she continued to dress in European fashion and receive figurines by mail. Her secret seemed to be that she always found a way to stay busy, solving domestic problems of her own making and doing certain things wrong that she corrected the next day. The only thing she needed to be completely happy was the birth of her children, but she respected the pact she had made with her husband not to have them before they were 5 years married. Looking for something to fill his dead hours, Gaston used to spend the morning in Melchiad's room, with the elusive Orleano. In addition to Sanskrit, Aurelian had learned English and French, and some Latin and Greek. Since he went out every afternoon then, and Amaranta Ursula had assigned him a weekly sum for her personal expenses, her room looked like a section of the Catalan scholars' bookstore. Gaston thought that he did not buy the books to inform himself but to verify the accuracy of his knowledge, and that none interested him more than the parchments. Both Gaston and his wife would have liked to incorporate him into family life, but Orleano was a hermetic man, with a cloud of mystery that time was thickening. It was such an insurmountable condition that Gaston failed in his efforts to be intimate with him, and he had to find other entertainment to fill his dead hours. It was around this time that he conceived the idea of establishing an air mail service. As the negotiations progressed, he prepared a landing field in the old enchanted region that then seemed like a plain of cracked flint, but was instilling in the town the dangerous suspicion that his purpose was not to plan itineraries but to plant bananas. In the meantime, he maintained a correspondence with the partners in Brussels similar to that of Fernanda with the invisible doctors, and ended up convincing them to ship the first airplane under the care of an expert mechanic, to assemble it in the nearest port and fly it to Macondo. A year after the first meteorological measurements and calculations, trusting in the reiterated promises of his correspondence, he had acquired the habit of walking through the streets, looking at the sky, listening to the murmur of the breeze, waiting for the airplane to appear. Although she had not noticed it, the return of Amar and Tat Ursula brought about a radical change in Aureliano's life. After José Arcadio's death, he had become a regular customer of the wise Catalan's bookstore. In addition, the freedom that he then enjoyed, and the time he had available, aroused in him a certain curiosity about the town, which he discovered without surprise. Aureliano did not find anyone who remembered his family, not even Colonel Aureliano Buendia, except for the oldest of the Antillean blacks. Aureliano talked with him in the convoluted papiamento that he learned in a few weeks, and sometimes he shared the rooster head broth that his great-granddaughter, a large black woman, with solid bones, hips of a mare, and teats of live melons, prepared. She was called Nigromanta. At that time, Aureliano lived by selling cutlery, candlesticks, and other knickknacks from the house. When he was without a penny, which was the most frequent, he managed to get the rooster heads that were going to be thrown in the garbage at the market inns, and he took them to Nigromanta so that he would make his soups augmented with purslane and scented with mint. When his great-grandfather died, Aureliano stopped visiting the house, but he found Nigromanta under the dark almond trees in the square, captivating the few night owls with their wild animal whistles. Many times he accompanied her talking in papiamento about rooster head soup and other delicacies of poverty, and he would have continued doing so if she had not made him realize that her company drove away his clientele. Though he sometimes felt tempted by her, and though Nigromanta herself had found it a natural culmination of her shared longing, he did not sleep with her. So Aureliano was still a virgin when Amar and Tat Ursula returned to Macondo and gave him a brotherly hug that left him breathless. Every time he saw her, and even worse when she taught him the latest dances, he felt the same helplessness of sponges in the bones that he disturbed her great-great-grandfather when Pilar Ternera gave him the excuse of playing cards in the barn. Trying to quell the torment, he immersed himself deeper in the scrolls and avoided the innocent flattery of that aunt. The arrival of the first night in which he waited for Nigromanta in the shade of the almond tree seemed eternal, and clutching in his fist the 50-cent peso he had asked Amar and Tat Ursula, not so much because he needed it, as to complicate her, debase her and prostitute her in some way with his affair. Nigromanta took him to his room lit with trickery candles, prepared to dispatch him as if he were a frightened child, and suddenly found himself with a man whose tremendous power demanded a seismic rearrangement movement from his entrails. They became lovers. Aureliano spent the morning deciphering parchments, and at siesta time he went to Nigromanta's soporific bedroom. It was the first time that Nigromanta had had a permanent man, a killer of the plant, as she herself said, dying of laughter, and she was even beginning to have illusions from her heart when Aureliano confided in her his repressed passion for Amar and Tat Ursula, which he had not been able to remedy with the substitution, but rather twisted her insides more and more as the experience widened the horizon of love. So Nigromanta continued to receive him with the same warmth as always, but she made herself pay for the services so rigorously that when Aureliano didn't have any money he charged them to her account. At dusk, Aureliano would pass through the corridor like a stranger, barely saying hello to Amar and Tat Ursula and Gaston, who usually had dinner at that time, and he would shut himself up in his room again, unable to read or write, or even think, because of the anxiety that he felt. They provoked the laughter, the whispers, the preliminary romps, and then the explosions of agonizing happiness that filled the house at night. That was his life 2 years before Gaston started waiting for the airplane. And it was still the same the afternoon he went to the Catalan wise man's bookstore and found 4 ranting boys, furiously arguing about the methods of killing cockroaches in the Middle Ages. He urged him with a certain paternal Molly Goodnighty to intervene in the controversy. He said that if they had managed to escape human ferocity it was because they had taken refuge in darkness, where they became invulnerable by man's congenital fear of the dark, but instead became susceptible to the splendor of midday, so that already in the Middle Ages, today, and forever and ever, the only effective method to kill cockroaches was solar glare. That encyclopedic fatalism was the beginning of a great friendship. Aureliano continued to meet every afternoon with the 4 discuss-ants, whose names were Alvaro, German, Alfonso, and Gabriel, the first and last friends he had in life. It had never occurred to him until then that literature was the best toy he had invented to make fun of people, as Alvaro demonstrated during a night out. The afternoon that Aureliano gave a lecture on cockroaches, the discussion ended in the house of the girls who went to bed because of hunger, a brothel of lies in the suburbs of Macondo. The owner was a smiling Mama Santa. His eternal smile seemed provoked by the credulity of the customers, who admitted as something true an establishment that did not exist except in the imagination, because there even the tangible things were unreal, the furniture that fell apart when sitting down, the disemboweled Victrola in whose interior there was a chicken hatching, the garden of paper flowers. Even the shy little whores who came from the neighborhood when the owner told them that customers had arrived, were a pure invention. Orleano, whose world at that time began in Melchiad's parchments and ended in Nigromanta's bed, found a donkey's cure for shyness in the imaginary brothel. Although Orleano felt linked to the four friends by the same affection and solidarity, to the point that he thought of them as if they were one, he was closer to Gabriel than to the others. The bond was born the night he casually spoke about Colonel Orleano Buendia. Gabriel, he did not doubt the reality of Colonel Orleano Buendia, because he had been a comrade in arms and inseparable friend of his great-grandfather, Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez. Those vagaries of memory were even more critical when talking about the massacre of the workers. Every time Orleano touched on the point, not only the owner, but also some people older than her, repudiated the hoax of the workers cornered in the station. So that Orleano and Gabriel were linked by a kind of complicity, based on real events that no one believed, and that had affected their lives to the point that both found themselves adrift in the undertow of a finished world, of the which only nostalgia remained. Fascinated by the discovery of friendship, stunned by the spells of a world that had been closed to him by Fernanda's pettiness, Orleano abandoned the scrutiny of the parchments, precisely when they were beginning to reveal themselves to him as predictions in encrypted verses. But the subsequent verification that there was enough time for everything without it being necessary to give up the brothels, encouraged him to return to Melchiad's room, determined not to waver in his efforts until he discovered the last clues. That was around the time when Gaston began to wait for the plane, and Amaranta Ursula was so alone that one morning she appeared in the room. "Hello, cannibal," he said. "Again in the cave?" She was irresistible, in her made-up dress, and one of those long necklaces of tarpon vertebrae. She leaned her elbows on the work table, so close and unarmed that Orleano heard the deep murmur of her bones, and became interested in the parchments. Trying to overcome his embarrassment, he caught the voice that escaped him, and spoke to him of the Levitical destiny of Sanskrit, of the need to code the predictions so that they would not defeat themselves, and of the centuries of Nostradamus. Suddenly, without interrupting the conversation, Orleano put her hand on top of hers, believing that that final decision would put an end to the anxiety. However, she took hold of her index finger with the loving innocence that she had many times in childhood. They stayed like that, until she woke up from her momentary sleep and slapped her forehead. "The ants!" she exclaimed. And then she forgot about the manuscripts. She went to the door with a dance step, and from there she sent Orleano with the tips of her fingers the same kiss with which she said goodbye to her father the afternoon they sent her to Brussels. "Later you explain it to me," he said. She had forgotten that today is the day to put lime in the ant holes. She continued to go to the room occasionally. Excited about that change, Orleano then stayed to eat with the family, as he hadn't done since the first months after Amaranta Ursula's return. Gaston liked it. In the after-dinner conversations, which used to last for more than an hour, he was hurt that his partners were cheating on him. The correspondence reached such a degree of reciprocal suspicion that Gaston decided not to write again, and began to suggest the possibility of a quick trip to Brussels, to clear things up, and return with the plane. However, the project vanished as soon as Amaranta Ursula reiterated her decision not to move from Macondo even if she was left without a husband. Then he thought that Gaston was not as stupid as he seemed, but on the contrary, a man of infinite perseverance, ability, and patience, who had set out to defeat his wife out of the weariness of eternal complacency, letting her get entangled in her own cobweb, until the day when she could no longer bear the tedium of the illusions at hand, and she herself would pack her bags to return to Europe. She found Gaston's system so perverse, but at the same time so effective, that she dared to warn Amaranta Ursula. Yet she scoffed at her suspicion, not even glimpsing the wrenching charge of love, uncertainty, and jealousy she carried within her. She pricked her finger trying to unstop her akin of peaches, and he rushed to suck her blood with an avidity and devotion that made her skin crawl. "Aurelian!" She laughed uneasily. "You are too malicious to be a good bat." Then Orleano overflowed. Giving her little orphan kisses in the bowl of her wounded hand, he opened the innermost passageways of his heart. He told her how he would get up in the middle of the night to cry helplessly and with rage in the underwear that she left drying in the bathroom. Frightened by the passion of that release Brutus, he said, as if she were spitting, "I'm going to Belgium on the first ship out." Alvaro had arrived one of those afternoons at the Wise Catalan's bookstore, loudly proclaiming his latest find, a zoological brothel. It was called El Nino de Oro, and it was a huge open-air hall. The first night that the group visited that greenhouse of illusions, the splendid and taciturn old woman who guarded the entrance in a rattan rocker felt that time returned to its springs. He sighed, "Aurelian." She was seeing Colonel Orleano Buendia again, as she had seen him by the light of a lamp long before the wars. It was Pilar Ternera. Years before, when she was 145, she had given up the pernicious habit of keeping track of her age. Since that night, Orleano had taken refuge in the tenderness and compassionate understanding of her great-great-grandmother, ignored by her. That real brothel, with that maternal owner, was the world that Orleano had dreamed of during his prolonged captivity. He felt so good, so close to the perfect accompaniment, that he didn't think of another refuge the afternoon Amar and Ursula shattered his illusions. He was ready to vent with words, but he only managed to let go in a fluid and warm and repairing cry, in Pilar Turner's lap. "Well, little boy," she consoled him, "now tell me who he is." When Orleano told her, Pilar Turner gave a deep laugh. There was no mystery in the heart of a Buendia that was impenetrable to her, because a century of playing cards and her experiences had taught her that the history of the family was a gear of irreparable repetitions. "Don't worry," he smiled. "Wherever she is now, she is waiting for you." It was 4:30 in the afternoon when Amar and Ursula came out of the bathroom. Orleano saw her pass in front of her room, and entered the bridal bedroom at the moment when she opened her robe and closed it again in horror. "Go away," he said without a voice. Orleano smiled, lifted her by her waist with both hands, like a pot of begonias, and threw her face up on the bed. Amar and Ursula defended herself from her. She scratched her face with her nails, but neither he nor she breathed a sigh. It was a fierce fight, a battle to the death, yet one that seemed devoid of all violence, for it was made of distorted assaults and spectral evasions, slow, cautious, solemn. In the heat of her fierce and ceremonious struggle, Amar and Ursula understood that the meticulousness of her silence was so irrational that she could have aroused the suspicions of her husband next door, much more than the din of war that she was trying to arouse. Avoid. Then he began to laugh with tight lips, without giving up the fight, but defending himself with false bites and unraveling his body little by little, until both became aware of being both adversaries and accomplices at the same time, and the fight degenerated into a conventional romp. And the aggressions became caresses. Suddenly, almost playfully, like one more prank, Amar and Ursula neglected to defend herself, and when she tried to react, frightened of what she herself had made possible, it was already too late. She barely had time to reach out and blindly reach for her towel, and jam a gag between her teeth, to keep from letting out the cat-like screeches that were already tearing at her insides. Pilar Turner died in the rattan rocker, one night of partying, guarding the entrance to her paradise. In accordance with her last will, she was buried without a coffin, sitting in the rocking chair that 8 men lowered with ropes into a huge hole dug in the center of the dance floor. After poisoning the animals, they boarded up doors and windows with bricks and mortar, and spread out over the world. It was the end. In the tomb of Pilar Turner, among psalms and beads of horrors, the rubble of the past was rotting, the few that remained after the wise Catalan finished off the bookstore and returned to the Mediterranean village where he was born, defeated by nostalgia for a tenacious spring. He had arrived in Macondo in the splendor of the Banana Company, fleeing from one of many wars, and he hadn't thought of anything more practical than setting up that bookstore. He spent half his life in the hot back room, scribbling his precious writing in violet ink and on sheets he tore from school notebooks, without anyone knowing for sure what he was writing. When Orleano met him he had 2 drawers full of those motley pages that somehow made one think of Melchiad's parchments, and from then until he left he had filled a third. The only people with whom he related were the 4 friends, to whom he exchanged their spinning tops and kites for books. He treated the classics with a homely familiarity, as if they had all once been his roommates, and he knew a lot of things that simply shouldn't be known. Instead, no human power could persuade him not to take the 3 crates with him when he returned to his native village, and he hurled Carthaginian expletives at the railway inspectors who tried to send them off as cargo, until he managed to keep them in the passenger car. "The world will have finished screwing up," he said then the day when men travel in first class and literature in the freight car. That was the last he was heard to say. German and Orleano took care of him. They helped him like a child, they pinned his tickets and immigration documents in his pockets with nurse pins, but in any case he inadvertently threw a pair of pants with half his money in the trash. On the eve of the trip, he pointed with a kind of lewd blessing at the piles of books with which he had endured exile, and said to his friends, "I'll leave that shit there." 3 months later, 29 letters and more than 50 portraits were received in a large envelope, which had accumulated in his leisure activities on the high seas. As the days went by, however, the reality on board mattered less and less to him, and even the most recent and trivial events seemed worthy of longing, because as the ship receded, his memory became sad. That process of progressive nostalgization was also evident in the portraits. In the first ones he seemed happy, with his invalid's shirt and his snowy lock of hair, in the glittering October of the Caribbean. In the last ones he was seen in a dark coat and a silk scarf, pale with himself and taciturn by absence. German and Orleano answered his letters. He wrote so many in the first few months that they felt closer to him than when he was in Macondo, and they were almost relieved of their anger that he had left. At first he sent word that everything was the same. However, those letters of recovery and encouragement gradually turned into pastorals of disappointment. Stunned by 2 nostalgias facing each other like 2 mirrors, he lost his wonderful sense of unreality, until he ended up recommending everyone to leave Macondo. and that wherever they were they would always remember that the past was a lie, that memory had no way back, that every ancient spring was irretrievable, and that the most foolish and tenacious love was in any case an ephemeral truth. Alvaro was the first to heed the advice to abandon Macondo. He bought an eternal ticket on a train that he never quite traveled. In the postcards that he sent from the intermediate stations, he shouted out the instant images that he had seen through the window of the car, and it was like shredding and throwing into oblivion the long poem of transience. Then Alfonso and German left, one Saturday, with the idea of returning on Monday, and he never heard from them again. A year after the departure of the Catalan sage, the only one left in Macondo was Gabriel, answering the questionnaires for a French magazine contest, whose biggest prize was a trip to Paris. Orleano, who was the one who received the subscription, helped him fill out the forms. He was the last thing that was left of a past whose annihilation was not consummated, because he continued to annihilate himself indefinitely, consuming himself within himself, ending every minute but never ending. The town had reached such extremes of inactivity that when Gabriel won the contest and left for Paris with 2 changes of clothes, a pair of shoes, and the complete works of Rabelais, he had to signal the driver for the train to stop. To pick it up. The old street of the Turks was then a corner of abandonment, where the last Arabs allowed themselves to be led to death by the ancient custom of sitting in the doorway. The city of the Banana Company was a plain of wild grass. The old priest who had replaced Father Angel, and whose name no one bothered to find out, awaited God's mercy stretched out in a hammock, tormented by arthritis and the insomnia of doubt. Orleano and Amaranta Ursula were the only happy beings, and the happiest on earth. Gaston had returned to Brussels. Tired of waiting for the plane, one day he put his essentials and his correspondence file in a small suitcase and left with the intention of returning by air. Since the afternoon of their first love, Orleano and Amaranta Ursula had continued to take advantage of the husband's few oversights, loving each other with ardor gagged in random encounters. But when they found themselves alone in the house, they succumbed to the delirium of overdue love. "What hurts me the most," he laughed, "is so much time that we lost." In the days of passion, he saw the ants devastating the garden, satisfying their prehistoric hunger in the wood of the house, and he saw the torrent of living lava taking over the corridor again, but he only bothered to fight it when he found it in his bedroom. Orleano abandoned the parchments, did not leave the house again, and answered the letters of the learned Catalan in any way he could. They lost the sense of reality, the notion of time, the rhythm of daily habits. They closed doors and windows again so as not to delay in stripping paperwork, and they wallowed naked in the mud of the patio. In a short time they did more damage than the red ants. They destroyed the furniture in the living room, ripped the hammock with their madness, and gutted the mattresses. Furthermore, while she sang with pleasure and died laughing at her own inventions, Orleano became more absorbed and quiet, because her passion was self-absorbed and burning. They indulged in the idolatry of their bodies, discovering that the tedium of love had unexplored possibilities, much richer than those of desire. One night they smeared themselves from head to toe in syrupy peaches, licked each other like dogs and made love like mad on the hallway floor, only to be awakened by a torrent of meat ants preparing to devour them alive. In the pauses of delirium, Amaranta Ursula answered Gaston's letters. She felt him so distant and busy that her return seemed impossible. So she Amaranta Ursula ruled out the possibility of an inopportune return. Orleano, for his part, had no more contact with the world than the letters from the learned Catalan and the news he received from Gabriel through Mercedes, the silent apothecary. Gabriel had had his return ticket reimbursed to stay in Paris, selling the old newspapers and empty bottles that the chambermaids took from a gloomy hotel on the Rue Dauphine. However, little by little, his news became so uncertain, and the wise man's letters so sporadic and melancholy, that Orleano got used to thinking of them as Amaranta Ursula thought of her husband, and both remained floating in an empty universe, where the only daily and eternal reality was love. Suddenly, like a boom in that world of happy unconsciousness, came the news of Gaston's return. Orleano and Amaranta Ursula were so identified that they preferred death to separation. So she wrote her husband a letter with contradictory truths, in which she reiterated her love for him and her longing to see him again, at the same time that she admitted the impossibility of living without Orleano as a fatal design. He sent a calm response to Gaston, a final paragraph with unequivocal wishes that they be as happy as he was in his brief conjugal experience. It was such an unexpected attitude that Amaranta Ursula felt humiliated with the idea of having provided her husband with the pretext he wanted to abandon her to her fate. The resentment worsened 6 months later, when Gaston wrote to him again from Leopoldville, where he had finally received the airplane, only to ask them to send him the velocipede, which of all that he had left in Macondo was the only thing he had for him. Sentimental value. Orleano patiently endured Amaranta Ursula's spite. He made an effort to show her that he could be as good a husband in good times as in adversity. When they ran out of Gaston's last money, they created between them a bond of solidarity that was not so dazzling and capito as passion, but that helped them to love each other as much and be as happy as in the troubled times of Solitude. When Pilar Ternera died they were expecting a child. Amar and Cat Ursula tried to establish an industry of fish vertebrae necklaces. But except for Mercedes, who bought her a dozen, she couldn't find anyone to sell them to. Orleano was aware for the first time that his gift of languages, his encyclopedic wisdom, his rare faculty of remembering the details of facts and remote places without knowing them, were as useless as his wife's chest of legitimate gems. Together, the last inhabitants of Macondo. They miraculously survived. Although Amar and Cat Ursula did not lose her good humor, nor her ingenuity for erotic pranks, she acquired the habit of sitting in the corridor after lunch, in a kind of sleepless and thoughtful siesta. Orleano accompanied her. The uncertainty of the future made them turn their hearts to the past, and those memories revealed to them the truth that they had been happy together for as long as they could remember. Going deeper into the past, Amar and Cat Ursula remembered the afternoon when she entered the silver workshop and her mother told her that little Orleano was nobody's son because he had been found floating in a basket. The only thing they were sure of was that Fernanda was not Orleano's mother. Amar and Cat Ursula was inclined to believe that he was the son of Petricotes, of whom she only remembered infamous fables, and that assumption produced a twist of horror in their souls. Tormented by the certainty that he was the brother of his wife, Orleano made a trip to the priest's house to search the oozing and moth-eaten archives for some certain clue as to his affiliation. He got excited about the possibility of being one of the 17 Orleanos, whose birth certificates he traced through 4 volumes, but the baptismal dates were too remote for his age. The arthritic priest who watched him from the hammock compassionately asked him what his name was. Aurelian Buendia, he said. Many years ago there was a street here called that, and at that time people had the custom of giving their children the names of the streets. Orleano trembled with rage. Oh. He said, then you don't believe either. In what? That Colonel Orleano Buendia waged 32 civil wars and lost them all, Orleano answered. That the army rounded up and machine-gunned 3,000 workers, and that they took the corpses to throw them into the sea in a train of 200 wagons. The priest measured him with a look of pity. Oh son, he sighed. It would be enough for me to be sure that you and I exist at this moment. So Orleano and Amar and Cat Ursula accepted the version of the basket, not because they believed it, but because it saved them from their terrors. As the pregnancy progressed, they became a single being, becoming more and more integrated into the solitude of a house that only needed one last breath to collapse. They had been reduced to an essential space, from Fernanda's bedroom to the beginning of the corridor. The rest of the house surrendered to the tenacious siege of destruction. The silver workshop, Melchiad's room, the primitive and silent kingdoms of Santa Sofia de la Piedad remained at the bottom of a domestic jungle that no one would have had the temerity to unravel. Her long and unkempt hair, the bruises that appeared on her face, the swelling of her legs, the deformation of her old and loving weasel's body, had changed Amar and Cat Ursula's youthful appearance when she arrived at the house with the cage of unlucky canaries and the captive husband, but they did not alter the vivacity of the spirit. The last thread that linked them to the world was broken in the 6th month of pregnancy, when they received a letter that was obviously not from the Catalan scholar. Just as he foresaw, the Catalan scholar did not write again. The foreign letter, which no one read, was left at the mercy of the moths on the shelf where Fernanda once forgot her wedding ring, and there she continued to be consumed by the internal fire of her bad news. Orleano and Amar and Cat Ursula spent the last few months holding hands, ending with love of loyalty the son who began with outrageous fornication. At night, cuddling in bed, they were not intimidated by the sublunary explosions of the ants, nor the noise of the moths. Many times they were awakened by the traffic of the dead. They heard Ursula fighting with the laws of creation to preserve the lineage, and José Arcadio Buendia searching for the chimerical truth of the great inventions, and Fernanda praying, and Colonel Orleano Buendia brutalizing himself with deceptions of wars and little gold fishes, and Orleano Segundo dying of loneliness in the days of the Parandas, and then they learned that the dominant obsessions prevail against death, and they were happy again with the certainty that they would continue to love each other with their appearance natures. One Sunday, at 6 in the afternoon, Amar and Cat Ursula felt the pressure of childbirth. Through her tears, Amar and Cat Ursula saw that he was one of the great Buendias, solid and willful like the José Arcadios, with the open and far-sighted eyes of the Orleanos. He's quite a cannibal, he said. He will be called Rodrigo. No, contradicted her husband. He will be called Orleano and he will win 32 wars. Only when they turned him face down did they realize that he had something more than the rest of the men, and they bent down to examine him. It was a pigtail. They were not alarmed. Orleano and Amar and Cat Ursula did not know the family precedent, nor did they remember Ursula's terrifying admonitions, and the midwife finished reassuring them with the assumption that that useless tail could be cut off when the child sheds its teeth. Then they had no chance to think about it again, because Amar and Cat Ursula was bleeding to death in an unstoppable spring. In the early hours, she made efforts to keep her good humor. She took the frightened Orleano by the hand, and begged him not to worry. But as Orleano's hopes for her abandoned, she became less visible, as if she were being erased from the light, until she sank into torpor. At dawn on Monday they brought a woman who prayed cautery prayers next to her bed, infallible in men and animals, but Amar and Ta Ursula's passionate blood was insensitive to any artifice other than love. In the afternoon, after 24 hours of despair, they knew she was dead because the flow ran out unaided, and her profile sharpened, and the welts on her face vanished in an alabaster dawn, and he smiled again. Orleano did not understand until then how much he loved his friends, how much he missed them, and how much he would have given to be with them at that moment. He put the child in the basket that his mother had prepared for him, covered the corpse's face with a blanket, and wandered aimlessly through the deserted town, looking for a gorge back to the past. He knocked on the door of the apothecary, where he had not been in recent times, and what he found was a carpentry shop. The old woman who opened the door for him with a lamp in her hand took pity on his madness and insisted that no, there had never been an apothecary there, nor had he ever met a woman with a slender neck and sleepy eyes named Mercedes. She cried with her forehead resting on the door of the old Catalan sage's bookstore, aware that she was paying for the overdue cries of a death that did not want to cry in time so as not to break the spells of love. He broke his fists against the mortar walls of El Nino de Oro, crying out for Pilar Ternera. In the last open room of the dismantled neighborhood of Tolerance, a group of accordions played the songs of Rafael Escalona, the bishop's nephew, heir to the secrets of Francisco el Hombre. The bartender, whose arm was dry and as if burned from having raised it against his mother, invited Orleano to have a bottle of brandy, and Orleano invited him to another. The bartender told him about the misfortune of his arm. Orleano spoke to him about the misfortune of his heart, dry and as if burned for having raised it up against his sister. They ended up crying together and Orleano felt for a moment that the pain had ended. But when he was left alone again in the last dawn of Macondo, he opened his arms in the middle of the square, ready to wake up the whole world, and shouted with all his heart, "Friends are sons of bitches." Nigromanta rescued him from a puddle of vomit and tears. At dawn, after a brief and clumsy sleep, Orleano regained consciousness of his headache. He opened his eyes and remembered the boy. He didn't find it in the basket. At the first impact he experienced an explosion of joy, believing that Amar and Ta Ursula had awakened from death to take care of the child. But the corpse was a promontory of stones under the blanket. She collapsed in the rocking chair, the same one in which Rebecca sat in the original days of the house to teach embroidery lessons, and in which Amar and Ta played Chinese checkers with Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez, and in which Amar and Ta Ursula sewed the clothes of the child, and in that flash of lucidity he became aware that he was unable to resist the overwhelming weight of so much past on his soul. Wounded by the deadly spears of his own and others' longings, he admired the fearlessness of the cobweb in the dead rosebushes, the perseverance of the tares, the patience of the air in the radiant February dawn. And then he saw the boy. It was a swollen and dry skin, which all the ants in the world were laboriously dragging towards their burrows along the stone path of the garden. Orleano could not move. Not because he was paralyzed by stupor, but because in that prodigious instant the definitive keys to Melchiades were revealed to him, and he saw the epigraph of the parchments perfectly ordered in the time and space of men. The first of the lineage is tied to a tree and the last one is being eaten by ants. Orleano had not been more lucid in any act of his life than when he forgot his dead and the pain of his dead, and he nailed the doors and windows again with Fernandez crossbars so as not to let himself be disturbed by any temptation in the world, because then he knew that his destiny was written in Melchiades' parchments. He found them intact among the prehistoric plants and the steaming puddles and the luminous insects that had banished from the room all traces of the passage of men on earth, and he did not have the serenity to bring them to light, but right there, standing, without the slightest difficulty, as if they had been written in Castilian under the dazzling glare of midday, he began to decipher them out loud. It was the history of the family, written by Melchiades down to the most trivial details, 100 years in advance. He had written it in Sanskrit, which was his mother tongue, and had encrypted the even verses with the private key of the Emperor Augustus, and the odd ones with Lacedaemonian military keys. The final protection, which Orleano began to glimpse when he let himself be confused by the love of Amar and Ta Ursula, was that Melchiades had not ordered the events in the conventional time of men, but rather concentrated a century of daily episodes, so that all coexist in an instant. Fascinated by the discovery, Orleano read aloud, without skipping, the sung encyclicals that Melchiades himself made Arcadio listen to, and which were actually the predictions of his execution, and found the birth of the most beautiful woman in the world announced. That he was ascending to heaven body and soul, and he knew the origin of two posthumous twins who gave up trying to decipher the parchments, not only due to incapacity and inconstancy, but also because their attempts were premature. At this point, impatient to know her own origin, Orleano jumped. Then the wind began, warm, incipient, full of voices from the past, murmurs of ancient geraniums, sighs of disappointment prior to the most tenacious nostalgia. He did not notice it because at that moment he was discovering the first signs of his being, in a concupiscent grandfather who let himself be carried away by frivolity through a delusional wasteland, in search of a beautiful woman whom he would not make happy. Orleano recognized him, pursued the hidden paths of his offspring, and found the moment of his own conception among the scorpions and yellow butterflies of a twilight bath, where a craftsman satiated his lust with a woman who surrendered by default. He was so engrossed that he did not feel the second onslaught of the wind either, whose cyclonic power tore the doors and windows off their hinges, stripped the roof of the eastern gallery and uprooted the foundations. Only then did he discover that Amar and Cat Ursula was not his sister, but his aunt, and that Francis Drake had assaulted Ryahacha only so that they could search for each other through the most intricate labyrinths of blood, until he engendered the mythological animal that was to put an end to the lineage. Macondo was already a terrifying whirlpool of dust and debris centrifuged by the wrath of the biblical hurricane, when Orleano skipped 11 pages so as not to waste time on two well-known facts, and began to decipher the moment he was living, deciphering it as he lived it, prophesying to himself in the act of deciphering the last page of the scrolls, as if he were seeing himself in a spoken mirror. So he took another leap to anticipate the predictions and find out the date and circumstances of his death. However, before reaching the final verse, he had already understood that he would never leave that room, since it was predicted that the city of mirrors, or mirages, would be swept away by the wind and banished from the memory of men at the instant in which Orleano Babylonia finished deciphering the parchments, and that everything written in them was unrepeatable forever and ever, because the lineages condemned to 100 years of solitude did not have a second chance on earth.